I want to, before we begin, just acknowledge today, May the 25th, 2021, is exactly a year since George Floyd was killed. And I want to recognize that today is a heavy day for many of us, but particularly for Black folks and Black communities. And just to encourage us to really be mindful of that and to reach out to our friends and colleagues who may be particularly having a tough day today. And I think it's a reminder that the work of racial justice is not done. The work of racial justice is ongoing, and we all have a responsibility in that work. And thank you for being here, because I think being here today is part of you carving out that responsibility in listening to what we have to say today and contributing to the conversation. So as I said, we're going to be thinking about bias and about racism, and I should start transforming and really living out that reconciliation. I'm going to start with a little story which seems relevant, seeing as we're going to be talking about narrative concepts today. It's a story about a physician who goes to see a patient after a cesarean section. The physician walks into the room and does the usual, how are you doing today? How are you feeling? How's your pain? And the patient doesn't really respond. She's sitting there and she looks, completely fine, but she's not actually saying anything. So the physician starts to look around the room, assuming that the patient doesn't speak English. She had Chinese ancestry. And so is immediately thinking, how am I going to get some translation going here? I can't communicate with the patient. And as the physician is doing that, the patient says, oh, I'm so sorry. It just took me a moment to process what you were saying because my baby was up all night and I'm just completely exhausted. So that doesn't seem like a very remarkable story in of itself, except to say that physician was me. And this wasn't particularly long ago. So even as somebody who does this work, even as somebody who's steeped in this work, who thinks about bias and anti-racism all of the time and writes about it and works with it, I still made an assumption about that particular patient in that particular moment. So bias is hardwired into us. Dr. Sukera, who is an expert in this and has a PhD in this, is going to talk much more about that. But I would like us to start by actually thinking a little bit about our own bias. And we're going to do something very simple. We're going to do an exercise, a writing exercise, which is called sentence stems. And all that means is I'm going to give you the first half of a sentence and I'm going to ask you to complete it. You can complete it any way you like. This is just for you. And you don't have to worry about it being grammatically correct. You're just going to write, and what we call this is stream of consciousness writing. So first thought is best thought. So you can either grab a piece of paper and a pen, which I highly recommend, or if that's not available to you immediately, you can just type on your computer. So I'm going to invite you to finish off this first sentence. And the way it starts is, one way bias has shown up in my professional life is, and you're just going to finish that off. One way bias has shown up in my professional life is, and when you finish that sentence, I'm going to invite you to finish the next one, which is, one way bias has shown up in my personal life is, one way bias has shown up in my personal life is, and lastly, what I hope to learn about bias today is, what I hope to learn about bias today is. Okay, so I just need to kind of hold these thoughts with you as we move through the next kind of 45 minutes or so, recognizing that 45 minutes is a very short time. We're really just going to be dipping our toe into the water today, but we hope that we can really just prompt you to start thinking about this. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Sukera now, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about the sort of science of bias. And we'll come back to some more writing shortly.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone for joining this afternoon. As we start in a reflective way, thinking about why we're here, it's a reminder that we're not here because this is something that just started in 2020. We're here not because we just want to feel good about this topic, but because we want to be part of something better. So what are we talking about as part of being an anti-racist leader? We talk about the concept of bias. We're talking about preconceived notions, beliefs, attitudes that might pertain to certain social categories. Discrimination is when biases are enacted in practice. And another important term to be aware of is microaggressions, which refer to indirect statements, actions, or incidents that negatively impact individuals and can cause harm. Although there's a lot of talk about implicit bias, it's important to remember that bias is always manifested in implicit, explicit, and structural ways. There can be biases that influence us outside of our awareness, automatically, despite our best intentions, but we also make explicitly biased decisions all the time. What's important to remember is that biases are baked into the fabric of our system. They're baked into the structures that we work in, that we learn in, and they're baked into society at large. We think about structural biases, just in line with the stems that were shared earlier, think about the ways in which racial biases in particular are baked into the system. We know race is socially constructed, yet in our education and healthcare systems, we have structural racist biases throughout those systems. Part of the challenge is that in many ways we design those systems without this in mind. The people who make policy decisions don't necessarily reflect perspectives that can think outside of one's own biases. Structural biases also show up in the way decisions are made in recruitment, hiring, promotion, and tenure. Biases also exist in between us. Personally mediated or interpersonal biases reflect social processes like stereotyping, labeling. They reflect things like devaluing and dehumanizing certain groups. But it's when we get to the self, when we get to the internalization of bias, where we begin to see some of the most harmful effects. Internalized bias speaks to when there's members of a group that have experienced negative messages about their own abilities and self-worth that manifest as self-devaluation, resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, and stereotype threat. It's important to remember that internalized biases aren't something that just affect others. They affect us. Our own internalized biases reflect the residue of our experiences throughout our personal and professional lives. To be an anti-racist leader requires integration and recognition of both personal and professional identity. Part of the challenge with the ways in which we talk about biases, and we see this around us all the time, is we tend to fall into a problematic paradigm where we're not biased, but everybody else is. Of course, the 26 of us on today are not part of the problem. And the solution lies in helping other people be better or be different. My early research really started with this question: if we're burning so much energy in these endless cycles of polarization of us versus them, back and forth, what would happen if we turned this around? If instead we spent our energy looking in the mirror instead of pointing the finger, and then reconciling what we see? And I'll turn it back to Dr. Sharda.
So we're going to do a little bit of that looking in the mirror now, recognizing that that can be uncomfortable and challenging. And again, to sort of reiterate that we're going to embrace a little bit of that discomfort today as much as we can. And we're going to use narrative to allow us to get into that idea of looking in the mirror. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a poem. And as you listen to this poem, I want you to just kind of Feel in your body how it feels listening to the poem. Maybe write down a few notes as you're listening. Maybe there are certain words or phrases that really resonate with you. Anything that you feel as you're listening to this poem. It's by a very famous poet who I'm sure most of you have heard of, Maya Angelou, and it's called Human Family. I note the obvious differences in the human family. Some of us are serious. Some thrive on comedy. Some declare their lives are lived as true profundity, and others claim they really live the real reality. The variety of our skin tones can confuse, bemuse, delight, brown and pink and beige and purple, tan and blue and white. I've sailed upon the 7 seas and stopped in every land. I've seen the wonders of the world, not yet one common man. I know 10,000 women called Jane and Mary Jane, but I've not seen any two who really were the same. Mirror twins are different, although their features jive, and lovers think quite different thoughts while lying side by side. We love and lose in China, we weep on England's moors, and laugh and moan in Guinea and thrive on Spanish shores. We seek success in Finland, are born and die in Maine. In minor ways we differ, in major we're the same. I note the obvious differences between each sort and type, but we are more alike, my friends, than we are unlike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unlike. We are more alike, my friends, than we are unlike. So usually if we had more time, we would kind of get into a really in-depth discussion about this poem and what it means to us and what came up for us. But because we're a little short on time, what we're going to do is we're going to actually move directly into a writing exercise now, thinking about holding up that mirror, thinking about identity, because until we really can grapple with our own identity and the elements of that and what has shaped us, we're not going to really be able to move forward to work in racial justice in a meaningful way. We need to sort of recognize where our own power and privilege are. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a prompt, which is just a line, again, that you're going to start with. And this time I'm going to let you write for a little bit longer. Again, first thought is best thought. Stream of consciousness writing, there's no way to do this wrong. We're going to write for about 5 minutes, and I'll keep the time so you don't need to worry about that. And the prompt that I'm going to ask you to work from is a line that begins like this. When others look at me, they see. When others look at me, they see. And you can just write from there.
So we've started to look in the mirror. And what our research tried to do is look at what happens when you hold up the mirror, particularly in a healthcare context. So in this study, we explored how do health professionals process and integrate feedback about their biases. And I would say this study didn't just change me professionally, this changed me personally, because I was really struck by the emotional response that we received. When you tell a health professional who's working as hard as they can, has high expectations of themselves and one another, that they might enact bias and discrimination without necessarily wanting to, well, they reacted very strongly. They said, that can't be true. This is fake. This isn't right. I am a professional, and professionals are objective and neutral, and professionals can't have bias. But at the same time, they also said, well, but I'm a human being too. And of course I have bias. Why this struck me is because it highlighted that a lot of the work that we try to do in this area speaks to recognizing one another's humanity, that shared human connection. But if there's something about the environments in which we work that actually encourages us to dehumanize ourselves, to compartmentalize our identity as a form of self-protection, then maybe there's something deeper that we need to better understand. If we hold up the mirror to ourselves and we think about this tension between us and them, the realization really is that we are in a culture that fosters toxic perfectionism. Like Dr. Kendi says, I am responsible for my racist ideas. They are not. To be anti-racist is to let me be me, to be myself, to be my imperfect self. The model that came out of our research highlights that to lead inclusively, to be an anti-racist leader, we have to set up organizations where we're actively and continually cultivating feedback, holding up that mirror, but not just doing that in a performative way, leaning into that feedback and reflect how it affects our mission and our meaning and purpose out of our work. And then it requires changing our explicit behaviors. In our research, we found simply making people aware of their biases doesn't actually help. It actually increases a sense of helplessness and frustration. But if you encourage people to make behavioral changes, and as it suggests in the heart of the diagram, you open up environments where people feel comfortable sharing their vulnerabilities with one another, then the people in the environment also become social reinforcers for that change. But above all, it's how you frame it. We can strive for that ideal, we can strive to be better, but we have to, at the outset of this journey, accept our flaws, our shortcomings, and our vulnerabilities. And I would argue it's more than simply accepting, it's embracing that imperfect self and recognizing that our humanity is what's going to be our tool. We will stumble more than we will stride, but it's by neutralizing that need to constantly do, and check every box that we can begin to focus not on the doing of anti-racist work, but on the being of a role model for unconditional empathy, a role model for humility, but also a role model in self-reflection and critical reflexivity. There's a wealth of literature on bias mitigation, and I'm not going to get into all of it today, but I am going to highlight 3 core components of this. The first is courage. If we recognize, like I said earlier, that our default is biased, our norms are biased, any work that seeks to address this will, by its very nature, be disruptive. And that requires courage to step over our line of comfort and not walk away and grumble to each other, but rather speak up rather than stay silent. But that courage is individual. Each individual gets to decide what that line is. We can't push people, and it's important to do that in a trauma-informed way. But it's also important to have the courage to be vulnerable and share that vulnerability with the world. It's important to have compassion for others, to see one another as complex human beings. But we also need to ground our work in self-compassion rather than falling into traps of self-blame and self-criticism. And the last point is recognizing that we tend to lean out, we tend to avoid these difficult conversations. We see this happening, and we see it happening here instead of recognizing what's really happening. We have to lean into those moments and seek connection if we want to see a path forward.
So how do we start to cultivate those 3 C's? How do we start to cultivate that courage, that compassion for one another and for ourselves, and that connection? And one of the ways that we can do that is through the framework of narrative medicine, through the framework of storytelling, story listening, story sharing. And in every culture and every religion, I talk about this framework of narrative medicine, but really storytelling is an ancient process that has been important in many cultures across the world. And this particular report that I referenced here from the Kellogg Foundation found that there's emerging science around the power of narrative within the context of efforts by diverse communities to find effective ways of communicating, of creating new, authentic stories that honor the complexity of the past while forging a more equitable future. So when Dr. Sequeira talked earlier about stereotypes, storytelling and story making can be actually a really important tool in disrupting those stereotypes. And I'm currently doing the SANYAS training, which is the Indigenous Cultural Safety training. And if you stop to sort of look at the stereotypes around Indigenous peoples, you can start to understand why storytelling is such a crucial and critical piece of disrupting that. So we're living in this world, even before the pandemic, of increasing complexity. Patient care is getting more complex. The world is getting more complex. We are now, 18 months into a pandemic, which is complex. And with that increasing complexity, we are also in a place of decreasing connection. And this is where narrative medicine can help us. So as Dr. Sequeira was talking about, how do we create space for challenging conversations? How do we sort of sort through the increase in complexity and the decrease in connection that we find ourselves in? And this is where narrative medicine can be a tool for us. And if you look at the literature around this, and particularly the literature written by Rita Sharon, who's sort of the person that coined this term narrative medicine at Columbia University, narrative medicine is a way that we can take what feels very chaotic, very complicated, and a seemingly formless experience, and we can lend to it some degree of form, some degree of clarity. And that can be done through writing. It can also be done through other art forms, but we're talking about narrative today. And what narrative does is it lends some kind of expression, some kind of intentionality to an experience that otherwise seems very chaotic, and also, because it feels so chaotic, can actually pass us by without notice. So how do we actually grasp onto that? How do we actually have that difficult conversation? And what we know from the narrative medicine literature is that sharing stories, being in story, mindfully listening, doing a little bit of what we did today in terms of that writing, is that it actually can lead to meaningful change. And there's a lot of meaningful change that it can lead to that we know about in the clinical literature, but what we also know is that it can lead to meaningful change in terms of advocacy, and it can be recognized actually as a form of action. And that action can then lead us to a place of belonging, a place of inclusion, and hopefully to a place of justice. There's also a lot of evidence around sort of the storytelling, sharing narrative framework around reduction in burnout, increase in wellness, better interprofessional team communication. So this is when we're thinking about being leaders. This is when we're thinking about how we inculcate that safety and create those spaces for our teams, for our organizations. And I think particularly it's been striking to me when I have facilitated these spaces specifically for racialized folks, for Black folks, for Indigenous community, that these are really spaces of healing when we can be with each other in community, sharing story, and getting to that place of vulnerability that Dr. Sakaria said is so central to this work. So just to sort of bring a little bit of the science to it, to recap very quickly, and this is a huge topic, as I say, but the main movements of narrative competence are sort of summed up in these three big buckets: attention, representation, and affiliation. So what attention means is that we're going to bring our attention by closely listening. And that's what we did when we listened to the poem. We listened to it with intentionality. And what we know from cognitive psychology is listening with intentionality, or what we call close listening, really allows us to hone our skill of perceptive attention. And that's why this has also been very useful in the clinical world, because it's actually been shown to allow clinicians to be much better observers and to hone that skill of perceptive attention. Once we have brought our attention to something that is in our perception, we then have to represent that thing. So this is when we go from that sort of seemingly formless thing to lending form onto it. And we have done that through writing about it, through giving it form through words. So what happens then is that we represent something that we've imagined in a much more concrete way now. And that can be done through painting, it can be done through filmmaking, it can be done through lots of different art forms, but we're talking about writing today. And then the ultimate goal is affiliation. So how do we then take that thing that we have represented and affiliate it into our practice, whether that's into our anti-racist practice that we're talking about today, whether that's into our teams, whether that's into our clinical leadership skills, or all of the above. And really what that affiliation piece does is it brings us to a place of empathy. It brings us to a place of shared understanding. And that's the integration, again, that we were talking about earlier. So we take this thing that we know is important, it feels formless, feels difficult, it feels chaotic. We lend to it some degree of form and representation, and then we affiliate it into our practice.
So as we embark on this journey, we know that it's going to be disruptive, right? We're going to be hit with different stresses along the way. And there's a dialectical tension between our vulnerability and our power. We often revert back to these coercive cycles of us versus them, and in particular do this within organizations, where we look to people with greater structural power than us to make and enact change, forgetting that we are part of organizations, we are part of society, and we can remake the world in big and small ways through our actions and our words every single day. Being attentive to and sensitized to power is a key element of anti-racist leadership. It's about being able to enact the ability to take others' perspectives, but also to fall into sharing power in an egalitarian way rather than holding power in a coercive way. And by being sensitized to our power and recognizing that most often our own power is invisible to us, that we can harness the tension between power and vulnerability and help move ourselves and our organizations forward.
I really like the way that Isabel Wilkerson frames this idea of race and as power that we've already talked about a little bit, of race as a social construct. And this is from her book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. And really, it just underscores what we were saying earlier, which I think came up so beautifully when Amy shared her piece about what race really means and have we really understood what is the history behind this labeling, the centuries of history behind this labeling. So often in this work, I think what people struggle with is they struggle with understanding how to share power. I think most people want to do that, but find it very difficult to actually move that forward as individuals or within their organizations or as leaders. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about allyship, which came up earlier, and I'm also going to talk about a concept called humility, which I think can be very helpful in this idea of sharing power. So I'm going to read a little poem, and we're not going to kind of talk about this poem necessarily, but if you have any thoughts as you're listening to it, you can certainly jot them down and reflect on them later. I'm going to read you a poem called Dakota Homecoming as we think about allyship, and it's by a Aboriginal Indigenous poet named Gwen Nell Westerman. "We are so honoured that you are here," they said. "We know that this is your homeland," they said. "Here is your button for the event," they said. "It means so much to us that you are here," they said. "We want to write an apology letter," they said. "Tell us what to say." So I think this is a really good example of what allyship is not. And so often we see that that burden of work is put onto folks who are actually at the receiving end of that oppression. So often we see some of that tokenistic idea coming up that Sudha was sharing a little bit earlier. So what does it really mean to be able to be an ally? And what I have found to be an excellent, very basic resource for people that haven't necessarily thought about this much before is the U of T Office of Inclusion and Diversity resources on allyship. And the next slide will have a QR code that should take you there. So if it's not something you've thought about deeply before, I'd highly recommend this resource. And it's got some very practical ways that you can actually practice allyship. What goes into a bit more detail, and again is a paper I would highly recommend, is this paper by Stephanie Nixon. And she really talks about critical allyship. And she has a model called the coin model of privilege, where she really breaks down what the intersections of identity are and where those intersections give us power and privilege, and where those intersections means that we may find ourselves in a place of being oppressed or silenced. And she really focuses on the people and the communities with power and privilege and says, what is it that you are going to do? Which side of that coin do you find yourself on? And how are you going to move that critical allyship forward? And I think this really relates strongly to what Dr. Zucchero was saying earlier, in that sometimes it can be very overwhelming to think about transforming our institution. Even if we want to do that, it can feel like an impossible task. But institutions are made up of people, and practicing critical allyship encourages individuals to transform their own institutions. And so that can come up in policy decisions, it can come up in recruitment, it can come up in hiring, all the things that we've talked about before. And so this approach really invites you to reflect on how your academic department or your professional body or your hospital cultural humility. And cultural humility is defined by the National Institute of Health as a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another's culture, but one starts with an examination of their own beliefs and cultural identities. So again, this is when the holding up of the mirror comes up. And I really like the idea of humility versus competence, because we can never really be truly competent in anybody else's culture. And as an extension, we can never be competent in anybody else's story. And so Sayantani Das-Gupta, who's a pediatrician and a narrative medicine scholar also in Columbia, talks about this concept of narrative humility. How do we approach stories with humility and vulnerability, and actually that lens of, this is not just about me trying to become interested and understand the story of the person in front of me, whether they be my patient, my colleague, whoever that may be. It's also about me putting myself in a place of vulnerability and holding up that mirror and starting to understand where some of my power and privilege lie, and how am I going to leverage that in a meaningful way. And I'm just going to finish with this quote here, which again, I think is really important when we start to think about the difference between what equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives often try to do, but where they often end up falling down. And again, they often end up falling down because organizations are not willing to reshape their power structures. And so how do we go from sort of EDI initiatives to actually transformative change? And that's something that I think, we're all working towards and trying to understand how we fit into moving forward that kind of transformation. So we are almost nearing the end of our time. We are going to end with some more sentence stems to kind of wrap up what we talked about today, recognizing again that 45 minutes is really us just dipping our toe into the water. And then we'll see, we may have time for a few comments and questions, but I'm going to give you just another 3 sentence stems to round us off today. The first one is, what I understand better about bias after today's workshop is. What I understand better about bias after today's workshop is. And the second one way I will commit to practicing allyship as a leader is. One way I will commit to practicing allyship as a leader is. And finally, one way I will attempt to practice humility is. One way I will attempt to practice humility is. I want to thank you all for being here and for your vulnerability and stepping into a little bit of discomfort today, which hopefully will lead you to a place of change.